Hello everybody, good afternoon and welcome to today's Regeneration and Housing meeting. We're not expecting the fire alarm to go off or a fire practice, so if the alarm does sound, please make your way out of the building as quickly as possible. Can I also ask people to put mobile phones onto silent, please, and do the same with your laptops as well if they're going to be making a lot of noise. The meeting is going to be recorded for our council channel, and if there's no members of the public, no. We'll move on to the agenda. Do you have any apologies for absence other than Councillor Cox and Councillor Cannings? And agenda item 2, consider the extent, if any, which the public and the press are to be excluded from the meeting. There's no agenda items which require exclusion. Are there any declarations of interest? No? And agenda item 4, the minutes from the meeting which was held on the 19th of October. Are they a true record? Thank you. And agenda item 5 is public statements, but as there's no members of the public here, I'll move on. Yeah.
A formal meeting.
Yes, Councillor Mount, it's a formal meeting. And before we move on to agenda item 6, we'll just do a quick round of introduction so we all know who we are. We'll start off with Scott.
Hi everyone, Scott Cardwell, Assistant Director for Economy and Development.
Hello, Helen Markland. I'm Principal Ecologist at Doncaster Council.
Hello, Richard Dobson, Planning Policy Team.
Hi, Nicola Ward, a Principal Planner in the Local Plans Team.
Good afternoon, Jonathan Clark, Planning Policy Environment Manager here at Doncaster Council. Thank you.
Thank you. We also have members present today from the Communities and Environment Committee. We thought it would be worthwhile to merge the meeting with everyone because the crossover of the work that we're undertaking. Agenda item 6 is the local plan. And I'll hand over to officers to lead us through there, please.
Thank you, Chair. Got a short presentation that was appended with the report pack that's gone out already. So hopefully around 20 minutes or so, if you don't mind me, I'll take us through those slides. I think it's probably almost a year ago since we last came to the panel with the first update on how the local plan had been reporting, and some of you will recall as part of the local plan going through the full council approvals process back then, it was agreed that we'd come to you once a year to give an update to the panel on how the local plan has been performing over the previous 12 months. So just a very quick overview of what I'll be running us through shortly. Just a very quick reminder about what the local plan is and what it's for to make sure we're all on the same page. Just going to update on what's been happening in the world, particularly of planning policy and what the team's been doing since we last came to you 12 months ago. We're then going to take a few slides just to look at some of the key headline monitoring indicators most relevant to the panel and see how the plan's performing. A bit of an update to what we shared with you last year for the first time. We're going to have a quick look at how appeals performance is going, because that can be a key indicator as to how successful the local plan is. I'm then just going to take one slide, giving a bit of an update on government planning reforms and where we're up to with those and what things may look like and change in the future. And then we'll pause there for some questions from the panel. So just by way of a very short recap, the local plan, as I'm sure you're all familiar, it's the key planning document for the Borough of Doncaster. It's the key, most important document in our development plan. It is used for determining basically anything that requires planning permission. So that could be a large extension to a dwelling. It could be a proposal for 1,000 new dwellings and everything in between that, as well as proposals for commercial employment development and all those other things as well. So we adopted our local plan in September 21. That was a full council decision. The plan period runs to 2035, but I think the key point to stress is we don't adopt the plan and then go away for kind of 15 years and then pick it up and see how it's been going. one of the key things you do post-adoption of your plan is obviously you're implementing it through the day-to-day determination of planning applications, but you're constantly monitoring it, you're seeing how things are performing, and you're feeding that back through annual monitoring. And we also have a legal requirement to review that plan every 5 years. So these things are never meant to be set in stone for as long as the plan period sets out. So hopefully that's just a helpful reminder as to what we're talking about when we're talking about the local plan and how it's performing. Just a slide to kind of stress the point that as well as adopting the local plan, yes, it's a big document, but there's also lots of things in there that it kind of commits the council to do post-adoption of the local plan to make sure we're putting in place a strong policy framework and all the additional guidance to help people bringing forward planning applications, bring forward their schemes that, you know, generally that we can positively determine and recommend for approval. So some of the key documents below the policies in the local plan are supplementary planning documents, and since we last came to the panel, we've adopted further ones in relation to flood risk, technical and developer requirements, loss of community facilities and open space, and also local labour agreements. So I think they were probably out to consultation about the time we came last year, but just to keep you in the loop, those have all subsequently gone on and been adopted and are being used on a day-to-day basis now. We updated the transitional planning guidance as well, because as we bring forward new SPDs to replace the old ones, there's still wider things that haven't been covered yet via SPD, so we have some transitional guidance. It doesn't have as much weight as the SPDs do, but it's making sure we're clear to our applicants and developers what policies they need to look at and how they can bring forward their applications in this still sort of transitional period. We have updated our statement of community involvement. Those must be updated at least once every 5 years, and that's not just about how we involve our communities in the plan making and local plan making, but it's also about how we involve them in planning applications and engaging with them throughout all stages of planning. So we've updated that. We do our annual suite of local plan monitoring. So we specifically look at housing, how much employment land's been delivered, how much minerals supply we've got, things like that. And those ultimately feed into an annual monitoring report that we do each year and publish on our website, which does look at the full host of planning policies that we've got against all the indicators that the local plan sets out as our ways of monitoring their performance. We've also published the Mexborough Town Centre Master Plan last summer, so some of you will be aware that went on for a little while some wider issues were being addressed in Mexborough Town Centre. But that's been published and is already paying dividends with the Levelling Up funding round 3 that was announced last year. We've published our first 5-year deliverable housing land supply statement. So we fixed our 5-year land supply position through the plan making and examination process in front of the government inspector at the time. However, that fix ran out last year, so you're then back on doing the annual 5-year statements. And some of you will be aware that if you can't demonstrate you've got a 5-year land supply, you have to consider lots of planning applications favourably. They may not necessarily be compliant with the policies in the local plan, but if they can demonstrate that they're sustainable development, there's almost something called the tilted balance that applies. So really important that we maintain a 5-year land supply. And what I can say is that we don't just have a 5-year land supply, we've got a 5-year land supply with a good extra few years on top as well. So we're in a good position with respect to that. We've adopted our first local heritage list. Again, that was something the local plan said that we would do. That's looking at assets that are really important to our communities. They've been nominated by people out there as being really important heritage assets. They may not have current protection and, list of buildings and things that have already got protection through planning, but nevertheless, they're really important buildings and assets and structures locally. And we've adopted that list, and we're also now exploring the use of Article 4 directions to give those assets additional protection from things like demolition and people altering and changing those without coming through the planning process. And there's a policy in the plan that essentially applies to any proposals for those. We've just finished consultation on another SPD with respect to proposals in the rural parts of Doncaster. So colleagues are currently working through the responses, and we'll be moving that forward towards adoption later this year. And we've also kept up to speed with various government consultations, responding on behalf of the organisation on our thoughts on various reforms and changes to planning. We also support town and parish councils with their neighbourhood plans. We've now got 8 adopted in Doncaster. We've got 3 at various stages of preparation. And we've currently got one at Tickhill that has a neighbour plan already, but they're reviewing their plan. So that's a key part of what the team does in terms of supporting our town and parish councils. And also we have an ongoing duty to cooperate. So the same way when we did our local plan, we had to demonstrate we'd worked with our neighbouring local authorities, statutory consultees on strategic cross-boundary matters. We have to help other local authorities. Sheffield, for example, are currently going through their local plan examination. So we're working with them on cross-boundary strategic matters under the duty to cooperate. So that's just a little flavour to show how busy the team's been in the last 12 months and everything that goes on post-adoption of a local plan. So similar kind of format to last year, what we tried to do is we haven't got time to cover every policy and every indicator in the local plan because there's over 70 policies and there's 100 odd indicators. What we've done is we've picked out the ones that are most relevant to the Regen and Housing panel. So the ones in green there, don't read into that those are going better and the ones in amber aren't as good because that's some sort of red, amber, green rating. All we're trying to do is highlight the green ones there that we're just going to spend a few minutes just going through. But I didn't want you to think that we don't look at all the other kind of indicators and policies in the plan. They're all in there. They're all in the wider monitoring. But for the sake of this panel and the time we've got, we're going to go through some of those ones in green, if that makes sense. So under the objective of supporting the conditions for attracting jobs and growth, then since 2015, over 10,000 full-time equivalent new jobs have been created. Those have very much come forward in sectors such as logistics, health and construction. During that time, though, we have seen some losses, particularly in areas such as public administration, business administration and education. We have seen significant growth in the number of small businesses. So those are businesses that employ up to 9 employees. And our employment activity rates are higher than the South Yorkshire Combined Authority average, but we are still 2% lower than the national average. Similarly, wages are still 2% lower than the Yorkshire and Humber average. But importantly for the local plan, we identified an employment land requirement of 481 hectares over the plan period to 2035. And up until the end of the last monitoring year, 292 hectares of that land has already been developed. 84% has been for warehousing uses. So as you can imagine, sites such as iPort have been key sites that have been delivering and contributing towards that supply in recent years. And at this point, 43% of the sites that we've allocated in the plan for employment have been developed. And what that trajectory at the bottom is showing, I appreciate it's a little bit small to see, but what it's just shown is that we're slightly ahead of the trajectory, which is in a good position to be, particularly if you factor in that we had the COVID-19 global pandemic and the global dip in delivery across the world essentially. So to say we've been through that unprecedented period and we've managed to bounce back and still be ahead of the trajectory slightly, I think is a really good position to be in. And perhaps in the early days of COVID, who would have thought perhaps that would have been the case? So there's some kind of key sort of headline figures around the jobs and growth since the local plan period started. The objective around regeneration and community pride. So retail businesses have increased since 2015, which might sound surprising given what we're witnessing on the high street, but what we can see is that that's a growth in things around the mail order and purchasing things online rather than perhaps the traditional purchasing from shops on the high street. We are seeing fairly stable retail levels in your kind of Thorn and Mexborough town centres, but there has been some decline in Doncaster city centre. And again, our observations is that's not unique to Doncaster, that's happening up and down the country. We're probably seeing less people, less footfall in our traditional city centres, more people using perhaps their own high streets, perhaps with the more remote ways of working. So perhaps what we're seeing is that slight kind of hollowing out from the city centre, but more growth and businesses being sustained in people's kind of local areas. Unfortunately, we do still feature in some of the wrong league tables in terms of we have the highest crime rate in South Yorkshire, and we're in the top 5% of local authorities in England for recorded crime. And we're also amongst the top 20% still of most deprived communities in England. And again, I think we talked about this last year. These are deep-rooted issues. They require a multidisciplinary, multi-agency team Doncaster approach, and the local plan isn't going to kind of overturn some of these fortunes in a few years from adoption. They're obviously complex matters, and there's a whole host of other kind of strategies and tools out there that perhaps more directly responsible for turning around some of those fortunes. But what we do have is a number of design policies now in the local plan that we managed to justify and are certainly driving up the quality of design and the built environment and proposals that are coming forward and all contributing to quality placemaking. In terms of homes and communities, just a quick recap. The local plan set a requirement of 920 new homes to come forward each year of the plan period. That's just over 15,500 new homes during that period. Importantly as well, there's a policy that requires between 15 and 23% of those to be affordable housing and preferably delivered on site in amongst existing developments and market housing. All new homes should be built to national minimum space standards. That's a policy that we managed to evidence and justify and have in our plan, and that certainly wasn't happening before the plan, and I know it was an issue that members often raised at planning committee about the size of some of the houses that were being built, and they needed to be big enough and fit for people's needs. And we've also got further policies relating to accessibility and adaptability, particularly looking at our ageing population, making sure these houses that are coming forward can be adapted as easily and as cost effectively as possible as people's needs change throughout their lifetime, and helping to allow people to stay in their homes and independent living for as long as possible. So in terms of how housing delivery is going, last year, just let me check I've got the figures right. So we built nearly 13 net new homes in the last monitoring year. That's an increase of 105 since the year before. And that's a record not just for this plan period so far, but you probably need to go back to the turn of millennium when we had house building levels quite as high as that. On average, we've built just over 1,100 new homes per annum since the plan period. And again, if you factor in the drop of the year of the kind of COVID pandemic and people being furloughed, the fact that we've managed to keep above where we need to be on housing delivery is also a real good, strong positive. Also positive that 63% of those homes that have been built have all been built on brownfield land. So that's using land that's previously been developed before we're using greenfield sites for housing. And just 3% has been built on garden land. And I know sometimes that's a real important thing that some of our neighbourhood plans and communities bring those forward, have been keen to have policies to try and stop what's sometimes called a garden grabbing and places almost becoming too dense. So that's a relatively low figure in the grand scheme of the number of houses that have been built. And I've already mentioned we've got a 7-year housing land supply for the current period, so we're in a good, comfortable position in that respect. This next slide, I appreciate some of the graphics are a bit small, but I just want to give you a little flavour for some of the info graphics and things that are in these monitoring documents if you want to have a look at those in your spare time. Some of those are reporting some of the figures I've just been referring to. So those bars show the net number of housing completions that have been built year on year, and you can see the slight blip in 2021 for COVID, but it did bounce back. But importantly, we're not just counting and monitoring numbers of houses, we're looking at where they're coming forward, because the local plan has a spatial strategy. It directed the majority of new homes to the Doncaster main urban area. After that, the 7 main towns, places like Thorne and Mexborough, and then a more modest allocation went to the service towns and villages, which is places like Asken, Edlington and those sorts of communities. So all this monitoring is making sure the housing's coming forward in the places where we plan for it to come forward. And again, there's a bit of a breakdown there on housing completions on brownfield and greenfield. Those pie charts in the bottom right corner are just giving you a little flavour for where we're up to with the housing sites we're allocated. So the green chunk of the pie is showing you what's been built and completed and people living in those houses today in the last few years of the plan period. The amber chunks are giving you a feel for what units have got planning permission. So those are the sites that will be building as we speak, and we will expect people to be buying houses on in the coming years. And then the red kind of chunk of the pie shows that those are the allocations still in the plan for housing that have still yet to come forward. So what that's giving us some comfort is that we've got a good even mix of sites that have been built, sites that are coming forward as we speak, and then some reserve in the kind of housing pipeline for later phases of the plan period. Just a couple of slides now on appeals performance. So applications that are refused, they have a right to go to an appeal in front of an independently appointed government inspector, where the appellant has their opportunity to tell the inspector why they think ourselves as a local planning authority has not made the correct decision to grant their planning application. What we've done is we've reviewed all the appeals that have been issued since the local plan policies have been applied and where policies have been used for a reason for refusal. As at January this year, we had 78 appeal decisions issued, and as you can see, by and large, the vast majority, at 85%, were dismissed by the planning inspector. So that was the planning inspector saying that the local planning authority made the right decision to refuse their planning application and that the policies were doing what they needed to do. 13% have been allowed and 3% have been part allowed and part dismissed. Of the 13% that were allowed, 30% were committee overturns, so that's where the planning committee has made a different recommendation compared to that the case officer presented to committee, and 70% were delegated decisions taken by the case officer. And just wanted to stress that if you do look at some of the reasons where appeals have been allowed by the inspector, rarely, if ever, do they kind of say because of the policy in the local plan. They're very kind of niche site-specific issues. So there's an example I put up there where it was allowed. It was all about the height of some acoustic fencing around a gypsy and traveller site. We don't have policies that detailed or specific in the local plan that talk about what an appropriate height of an acoustic fence should be. So I'm kind of making the point that it's not the policies in the plan, it's perhaps some of the more detailed guidance where things have come to a different recommendation than the local planning authority. Just wanted to take a moment to update on planning reforms. I think when we last came, the Levelling Up and Regeneration Bill was still passing through the various stages. That received royal assent in October 23, so is now an act. And I think the main point to stress is we've come a very long way with what we heard from the summer planning white paper back in 2020, where I think phrases I heard, the most radical overhaul of town and country planning since it's ever began was bandied about as what was being proposed. Some of those proposals have been amended, some have been kind of scaled down, and some have been dropped altogether. One I think that was the most controversial was plans were going to allocate growth zones, almost kind of give outline planning permission through the plan making process for areas, and a very small slimmed down role for applications and planning committees and things at the back end of that. So that was something that I do recall was quite controversial and seems to have been dropped altogether. Some of the key measures, though, so we are starting to find out a bit more about the new local plan making system and the planning reforms, but there's still lots of secondary legislation that still needs to come forward before we get some of the details still about how some of this is going to work. Some of the key measures are still going to be subject to their own separate consultation from government in due course. So, next year we'll happily come back and report back on where we're up to. Some of you from Planning Committee will be aware that a new national planning policy framework was also published in December last year. That does have some implications for plan making around things like housing numbers. But just to give you a little flavour for some of the things we're starting to hear about in terms of new plans. So the government set a deadline from the end of June next year, 2025, that plans will have to be prepared under the new system. So there's a kind of transitional opportunity for some that are still getting their local plans in place. If they don't get something submitted and under examination by that deadline, they'll have to start looking at a local plan in line with the new system. What we're starting to know a bit about the new system is the government is going to do some national development management policies. So we don't know what they're going to cover. There's speculation that it may cover things like greenbelt, flood risk, perhaps some heritage. So those sorts of things that would apply across the piece, up and down the country in England, we understand those will be covered via national development management policies. We will not therefore be expected to have policies that repeat or duplicate those in our own local plans under the new system. So that's one big change that we've picked up about. The government are also very clear that I think the average at the moment is 7 years for a local plan to be put in place from inception to adoption. The government wants plans to be put in place 30 months from decision to do a plan to adoption via full council. One of the ways they see that's going to be speeded up is that we won't be having policies because some of it will be covered via national development management policy. They want 3 gateway tests. So at the moment, you do all your plan making, you do all your consultation, we get that approved by full council as the official plan to publish for the council to be examined. You then go in front of a government inspector, and if you haven't got it right and you have to withdraw your plan, you've kind of gone 80%, 90% through the process, and you're going to have to go back to square one. So these kind of gateway tests, I understand there's going to be 3 of those. They involve the planning inspectors and other technical experts that will do a bit of a soundness check with you as you go and make sure you don't get too far down the new plan making process to fall down at the examination. So I can see some logic in having those kind of temperature checks throughout the plan making process rather than it all being built in towards the end. We understand things like duty to cooperate is going to be abolished with a new flexible policy alignment test. So we'll have to wait to see what that entails in the future, and perhaps a whole host of other things as well that we're still to find out about. But that's just a bit of a flavour of some of the things that we've picked up so far. And as I said, next year we'll hopefully be able to give you a bit more detail about what that means. So I'll pause there and happily try and respond to any questions. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you for that. We'll open up questioning. Could you outline the performance of the local plan and how it's serving the needs of the residents of Doncaster?
Thank you, Chair. Well, I hope you can see from the presentation that the local plan is performing well and serving the needs of the city. Both employment and housing development are performing above target, which shows that we have allocated the right sites in the right locations. As part of that, 10,000 full-time equivalent new jobs have been created. And in fact, as part of the local plan evidence base, we had to do forecasting work. And the trajectory in that forecasting work sort of ties in as to where we are right now, even taking COVID into account. So I think that shows that we're performing well in that respect. As Jonathan has said, in the last monitoring year, a record number of new homes have been built across the city. And linked to that, we have affordable housing targets in the local plan, which are obviously there to help provide housing for those people who can't access the local housing market. But aside from all of that, we also have policies in the plan for, highway improvements and new roads and green infrastructure and design and so forth, which links all that together, improving the quality of life of the people who live and work in the city.
Thank you. Councillor Mounsey?
Could I ask colleagues and officers, could you expand on and explain, with the planning system being robust, why there are still a great number of plan applications going to appeal? There must be a reason there. When I look through it, through you, Chair, there's more defined definition on page 30 of this. But could you please explain this? And part 2 of the question is, in line with the National Model Design Code, where are we, Doncaster, with this? Has it become law? Is it still waiting to become law? If it is, what effect will that have on us, especially our planning committee members? It's a guidance for them to follow that you should get and give to them. Thank you.
If you turn your microphone on.
Sorry.
Thank you, Councillor Mounsey, for your question. I'll do the appeals bit. There will always be some applicants who don't like the decision made on their planning application. It's just a fact of life. And all applicants have the right to appeal. So some will choose to go down that route. At the end of the day, some of those appeals will have a slim chance of being allowed and some will have no chance of being allowed, but it's their right to chase that route. And some just come down to things like design, which is quite subjective at times, or things like residential amenity. So, you'll always get that balance that some will get allowed and some will get upheld. And we have one, some which have been, for example, residential development in countryside policy area, and the local plan has held those up. But people do want to try and see if they can get, permission through the appeals route. Does that help?
It does, Chair. Nicola, what the thing is, these appeals of 85, 78 appeal decisions, is it that these applicants, especially the major development applicants, have found, or they think they found a way to get in there, get passed through the planning committee rules we haven't all of them. 78 is a lot. But like you said, they're getting turned down. So I'm just wondering where they are. And again, the last part is this National Model Design Code. I've never heard of this, but that hopefully can you inform us what effect that will have, or impact will that have on our planning committee and the planning officers? Thank you.
It's a good question, Councillor, on the design code. That's something that I completely glossed over, and I could have given you an update as an example of some of the stuff that was in the Levelling Up and Regeneration Act. So yes, you're right to pick up on it. We do need to do a design code now. That's set out for us in the Act. That's something previously perhaps we would have done through some sort of design guide supplementary planning document, but we have started some initial work on a design guide that will now be taken forward as a design code. We have taken on some extra resource just this week to help our design colleagues with bringing the design code forward. So that's something we will be able to report back on, hopefully maybe later this year, and see how we cascade that and engage members with that. But ultimately, you're absolutely right. That's something that we'll also need to make sure planning committee are aware of and engaged with. And we're still kind of scoping how that document's going to work, particularly in a borough the size of Doncaster. If you think about the huge array of kind of character areas and communities and villages and settlements and what they're out there and how different they are, we're trying to get that balance of having something that's going to be able to cover the needs of all the different kind of communities in terms of what a design guide or design code would normally focus. Whereas you can imagine for maybe a very urban authority, it might be more much of a muchness. So that's work in the pipeline, and we'll be able to update on that probably towards the back end of this year, Councillor.
Do you foresee any sort of negative impact this National Model Design Code could have at the moment?
It shouldn't be negative to the counter. It's all part of the government building back beautiful and including the improving the quality of place and our built environment, and creating places and communities where people want to live and are proud of. So absolutely not. It should be a positive. But as I say, we're still kind of scoping out what that appropriate level of detail is.
Councillor Noon.
Chair, sorry, just coming on the appeals point that you said, John, I think it's a testament to the team with a local plan that they've put together that we can't stop people going for appeal. Obviously, if people are refused planning permission, they do have the right to that. But I think if you look at the success rate, that 85% of those are dismissed. Now, pre the local plan being adopted, that rate would have been much higher. So it's just showing that we have got robust policies in there. And really, a lot of people are going to try and obviously press the appeal, and it's a robust process. That's why it's there. If people feel that whether it's through officers' reports or through planning committee, they don't feel a decision's gone the way, it's quite often they will take it to the end of. So we have seen a few, but the good thing is I'd be worried if we were seeing, say, 60% of them being dismissed. We'd be in trouble then, and around our policies. So that 85% being dismissed is really good, and it's really a big vote of confidence in the policies, that basically national government inspectors from the planning inspectorate are agreeing with our policies and decision making against them.
That's Chair. That's just quickly. That's why Scrutiny here to get assurances from younger people. You're our lock and key, our officers, right? We need to ask these questions to find out where we are. But like you say, the system at the minute is looking at it and it seems to be working very well. Thank you, Chair.
Councillor Pearson, I'll bring you in, then Councillor Beach, then we'll go to Councillor Noon. Councillor Pearson, do you have a question?
I have several questions, actually. You mentioned, obviously, that 15% have been ruled against us. How do we benchmark against other authorities? in that area? And what benchmarking are you doing against the other planning authorities that are surrounding us on our delivery of housing impact on business? Because we're obviously competing in the same market, and therefore developers tend to build where it's most appropriate to them, where the skill levels are right, the infrastructure and what have you. My next part really is my concern that we are far from meeting our requirements in the disability discrimination area and EVs, along with our continuation to have substandard roads within the borough that were not adopted under a Section 42 or a Section 38, and the number of properties that relate to being built on what some people call as unadopted roads, other people call private roads, yet they are not maintained and cause massive problems in and around the buildings that we're giving planning permission for when we infill on brown sites and or develop and restructure and repurpose existing properties. Thank you, Chair.
Chair, if I pick up the unadopted road element on that. So obviously if we allocating land for residential purposes in terms of housing sites, when we do see the developers come forward and they do have estate roads, clearly they have to be brought up to an adoptable standard if they're larger than serving, I think, is it more than 5 dwellings? Because you can have up to 5 dwellings off a private drive, I think. So we'd always push for that, and a Section 278 agreement will be signed for that. What we can't do is, there are a number of unadopted roads in the borough. It is always a challenge that they just, you know, our highways team haven't got the budget to make good and adopt all of the unadopted roads, and I think they do approach it in a prioritised fashion. I suppose, unfortunately, you may get some infill developments within residential areas that may end up going onto unadopted roads. But certainly what we do try and do is make sure all kind of vehicular standards in terms of safety, like if new development is going onto adopted roads, we ensure that there's turning areas in so that people are coming out in a forward gear and things like that. But you will get some development which is taking place off private roads. Unfortunately, the planning system's not geared up to be able to resolve those issues, and I'd say it's just a wider highway budget issue that is we're no different really to anywhere else in the country. There's lots of unadopted roads out there which can cause frustration, but the new bigger developments, they are all, we made sure that those roads are done to an adoptable standard before the council takes adoption of it.
Thanks, Scott. I'll try and pick up the couple of points around appeals and benchmarking of delivery. So I don't have any figures in front of me as to how we prepare into compare in terms of our appeals with our neighbouring authorities. I guess you've got to make sure it's a fair comparison, because neighbouring authorities are all at very different stages with the plan making process. So I've mentioned earlier Sheffield's yet to go before their inspector. So Sheffield's got a handful of strategic policies from back in, I think it was around 2009. But they haven't had any detailed policies adopted recently. They've not allocated sites recently. Rotherham and Barnsley have had more recent up-to-date plans. So I can't kind of compare and say how we are benchmarking, but appeals performance is a key thing that the government do monitor, and it is something that, you know, if you're a local authority losing appeal after appeal after appeal, it suggests something's not quite working correctly, and I understand they're not afraid to go in and investigate and see what's going on there. So I don't have those figures. It's certainly something perhaps I could inquire and see what our neighbouring authorities have got in their own monitoring and perhaps follow up with. In terms of how we benchmark with delivery of kind of housing and employment land take-up, again, it's difficult to compare when, you know, Sheffield's at the point they're at and we're at where we are with a recently adopted plan. What might be a really useful document, Councillor Pearson, that we could perhaps circulate around is the South Yorkshire Mayoral Combined Authority Statement of Common Ground, because there's some tables in the back of there that shows what Doncaster's housing numbers, requirements, completions are, what Sheffield's are, what Rotherham's are, what Barnsley's are, what their 5-year land supply position is, what their employment land requirements and things like that are. So that gives you a flavour for kind of their sort of scales of ambition and their scales of delivery. But end of the day, Sheffield is probably always going to be delivering more houses than Doncaster, but a very different approach there with lots of city centre, urban apartment density type accommodation. Perhaps something we'll see more of in Doncaster in the future. Barnsley and Rotherham perhaps a bit more comparable with the nature of their boroughs and their communities, and slightly more dispersed settlement patterns than Sheffield. So we do have that sort of information, Councillor, and we'd be more than happy to share that as an action with the panel if we think that would be helpful.
I think it would be good for you, Jonathan, to respond in writing with those comparative figures just to satisfy Councillor Pearson's query, if that's okay. Yeah. Councillor Beach.
Thank you. A couple of points, really. One is, if you want to know or keep track of the decisions, when the planning committee agenda comes out, if you go past the applications and you go to the back, there's the section which says appeals, and it gives you a list of, you don't have to read them all, it gives you a list of the appeals, and very often there's 4, 5, sometimes 6, and they're almost always we won the appeal. And on saying that, what I was originally going to say was we are also subject to the vagaries of the inspectorate, because on your overheads you showed a planning appeal decision for West Lodge Sutton Road Council. Now, it's appeal dismissed. Good. The trouble is, there was one over the road that they allowed. Now, they're in the same sort of area. They're all not conservationists, but the council area, and they're virtually opposite each other, yet one inspector allowed one inspector dismissed one. So, sometimes you're just stuck with the vagaries of an inspector's...
I think we all know, I think planning applications are all taken on their own merit, aren't they? So I think that's part of the reason why different outcomes are achieved with applications which often do seem very similar on paper.
The trouble was, the one they passed, it was the most hideous, and it wouldn't fit any design criteria.
I'm sure it was absolutely lovely and beautiful in someone's opinion, and I'm sure the architect put a lot of effort and time into it. Councillor Noon.
Thanks, Chair. How will the council manage its housing stock, particularly keeping up with the ageing population and provision of bungalows and supported living?
Thanks, Councillor. I'm probably not best placed to comment about how the council's managing its housing stock as a kind of a policy planner. That's probably a question more for kind of St Ledger and strategic housing colleagues. I think we've got around 20,000 St Ledger properties, and I think there's about 4,000 housing association ones out there as well. What I hopefully can help you with is what the local plan and what planning policy is doing to help make sure we're meeting the needs of our ageing population, if that's okay. I'd draw you to probably two key policies in the plan. One is policy 45, which is around standards. Now, this is a policy that we had to do a load of evidence to justify it being in the plan, because it comes with a cost to the developer. And it's a way that we've introduced what's called M42 and M43 through the building regulations. And we've managed to get a policy that justifies, so wherever we've got housing sites, 10 or more homes coming forward, 65% of those need to be built to M42, which is about accessibility standards, and 5% need to be built to M43, which is wheelchair adaptable. So those standards are making sure that these homes that are being built can be as easily adapted, modified, changed during the lifetime of the person living in that dwelling, rather than steps and things that means that no longer meets their needs later on in life, and they have to then look for an alternative property. So we've got policies in there, and that means that all the sizable development schemes coming forward through planning have to look to comply with those. The other key policy in the plan is policy 7. That requires an appropriate mix of house types, which is informed by the latest council housing needs assessment, which obviously picks up on the fact that we have an ageing population. In the back of the local plan, we've got some specific settlement by settlement what the housing need position was from that study. It breaks it down into communities, number of bungalows, whether they're 1, 2, 3 bed bungalows. So that gives the applicant a real good understanding of what they should be looking to put in their proposals when they're drawing up their applications. Our strategic housing colleagues are a key consultee to those applications, so they will constantly be looking at the housing needs evidence for that community, looking at the applications that the applicant is proposing and seeing how they do or don't fit with the housing needs of that area. I think ultimately with bungalows, we know what the challenges are. They require quite large plot sizes. They take up more land, which means perhaps you can't get as many additional houses on a development plot. What I can say is I think that the local authorities is leading by example on this. I know that the Council House Phase 2 programme that came through planning just last year and will be being built shortly, if not already. I think from memory, over a third of those properties were bungalows. So again, we're showing how we as a local authority can, lead and influence these important agendas, and hopefully that, the market and private developers will also follow suit, and in line with our own latest housing needs study. So I hope that kind of answers your question, albeit perhaps I say I'm not entirely sure what's happening in terms of the council's own housing stock, but I'm sure that's something the panel could get an update from colleagues in due course.
Thank you for that. It's just good to see that in the planning that we are putting in the figures, so we've got to it that, so we are looking further ahead to implement them adaptations and stuff for housing. I'll follow it away. Paragraph 22, it says there'll be further consultations undertaken. Who will the consultations be with, and what methodology will be used? And then also on that part, it says about we're building homes we've had some at bottom of Highfield Road in Asken, affordable housing, all getting solar, EV charging points and stuff. They're affordable housing. I've not seen an electric vehicle on the site, so we're building electrical plugins for people who can't afford electrical vehicles. We're not then providing, we're not building with solar panels or solar storage. We're sort of jumping way down the line rather than building what we need infrastructure-wise. Just the planning and policy behind that.
If I just answer the bit about the consultation. So that paragraph 22 is sort of referring to the government consultations that are going to come out in due course. As part of the Levelling Up Bill, Act now, they said they're going to do a lot more consultation, and that will include, sorry, what you've just said, so the EV charging, all that kind of thing. There's a number of things they're going to consult on. I have checked, and they haven't published anything as yet. What central government always do is put it on, do web-based consultation now, and you can respond to it web-based, and anybody can respond as long as obviously you meet the deadlines. They're not generally that well publicised, if I'm honest, but we tend to sort of know in-house, if you like, when everything goes out to consultation, and we tend to see if we need to do a response or not. So I don't know if officers can help you at any point if you wanted to comment on that when it comes through. But there will be drip feeding consultation on various topics throughout the next, until the election, I should imagine.
Yeah, it's just it doesn't. Obviously, you've explained that it's going to be a national thing, and that's just not really explained. For it to be more of a local consultations around flood management and flood risk and EV and all that stuff. So if it is a national, I think as a council we probably need to put that out more. And try and get more feedback from people, because I don't think I've done one since I've been in. So that'd be good too.
We tend to get to know about them through, like, if you sign up to a newsletter, for example. That's how we tend to know about the consultations. I mean, they're not something that they put out freely everywhere, are they? So maybe we could circulate that sort of thing. I don't know.
So just to clarify on this, so these consultations will be done at national government level, and they'll be pushed out to residents via, is it web-based services and emailed and such? Okay, and is there any other, I mean, typically, I don't know if you've got the figures or if you'd be able to access those, but these kind of government consultations, how effective are they? What kind of uptake do we get? Do people really engage with that? Or as a local authority, do we think there's better ways and methods that central government could be engaging with our residents in Doncaster And is there any way for us to feed that back into national government to let them know that whether their method is effective or not, or what we could do to improve that? Is there any way of that?
The government are going very much down a internet-based approach where it's just all done on the web. I mean, I don't have any figures of how successful that is, but I suspect the people that respond are local authorities and developers and agents when it comes to the planning issues. Everything comes out from DLUC that we respond to. I have no idea how effective it is. It's
I mean, if we were to, I know we've done a lot of consultation locally in Doncaster, and the techniques that we use, and the models we use for community engagement, what we find is solely basing something on web-based or digital often misses the most marginalised communities, doesn't it? And the people that we need to engage with probably more. So, I mean, maybe that's something that we need to be feeding back as well, that it's, central government engagement needs to be done on a wider level, and maybe that involves better funding for local councils to do that work on their behalf. Just a thought. I'm not expecting a response from any officers on that. I know you're not going to get political, so it's just a thought that I had.
What I would say is they don't tend to give us much time to reply, so we have to have quite a quick turnaround.
I think the big thing that we're going to see, because again, it's a key part of the Levelling Up Act, is this kind of digital agenda. The government seems fairly adamant that through those sorts of techniques, planning will perhaps engage with a very different demographic to perhaps that what's seen as currently being the people that perhaps spend most of their time looking at, what's happening in the planning press and planning news. We don't know what those techniques are going to be. We don't know what the resource implications might be for those. Yes, on the extreme, I've seen things people putting on virtual reality headsets and being able to look at what a whole redeveloped part of a city centre or a community might look like, but clearly that's hugely expensive. So it's all still something that's going to come out, but we are getting loud and clear messages that just putting kind of PDF documents on council websites isn't going to kind of cut the mustard. We're going to have to do more than that, but as ever, there'll be resource implications, and we'll do our best. You'll probably recall through the local plan making process, we took a decision authority to go big on supporting town and parish councils whenever we were doing consultation. We'd be sending officers out to their meetings, taking the material, making sure they understood it. We thought that was a pretty powerful way, as well as going through yourself and reaching our town and parish councils. I accept there's large parts of the borough that aren't parished, and how do you reach those communities? But that's all something when we get onto the next local plan under the new system, that statement of community involvement, I think, becomes a slightly rebranded document, but we'll have to explore what we're going to do and how we're going to engage and make sure people are feeding back to our plan. But I guess the way we see it is we're here to try and respond to the government consultations and act on on behalf of our communities and yourselves. And we make sure we brief portfolio holders and that they're happy with what we're responding to. So hopefully that's a bit of assurance as to the kind of various tiers of how it kind of goes up and down between our communities and government, and then back down again, if that helps.
I don't think Councillor Noon's second part of his question was answered around the installation of electric charging points in affordable housing.
Yeah, I can try and help with that. And it's something I've had not just unique to affordable housing schemes. We've had large volume house builders say, why do we need to provide this today? Because most people haven't yet got an electric vehicle, so it's not needed. And we do have a policy in the local plan that required EV charging. Not long after the local plan was adopted, there were changes to building regulations and Part S a couple of years ago. So that's an example where through building regulations, the government is now making developers do things, whereas previously it was just a policy requirement. I mentioned before about standards. That's another thing that perhaps if the government wanted to see more of, rather than leave it to individual local authorities to have plans that have to be justified through viability and things and can still be negotiated away, doing things through building regs, developers have to do it. It helps with economies of scale. It drives down the cost. I guess the response to why now when it may still be not required for some time is that the houses we're building today, I hope are going to be here for at least 100 years, if not longer. And hopefully during that time, even if EV vehicles aren't affordable and accessible to everyone at the moment, hopefully they will be at some point during the lifetime of that development. So I don't know if that helps, but as I say, it's one where the policy has been superseded by a building regulation requirement now anyway.
It makes sense in the long run. It's just, it's backwards for me, so I don't know if that's a national thing or something we can approach as a council on building regs and stuff. But we're putting in EV points and we're still draining National Grid. The old solar panels and storage, that's got to be in place first to make it affordable anyway. Otherwise you're buying electric from board at 50 odd pence kilowatt. It's not financially viable for vast amounts of people. If you were a building regs that every new build's got to have solar power and storage, and yeah, the EV it goes hand in hand. Right now we've just got one way out the other. It doesn't really make sense because we're still spending all that money to buy electric front board. It makes no sense.
Yeah, we've had discussions about should everything be in there ready to plug in today, or is it about making sure the infrastructure's in there so things can be, provided in due course as and when the demand or the need is there. So that is something I have heard, before, and I can appreciate where people are coming from on that.
Councillor Pearson.
Thank you, Chair. I'm just going to say 1899 to your comments about the EVs and disabled parking, because you didn't answer that part of my question either. I'm deeply concerned that we're putting in electric charging units that are not disabled accessible, yet national policy is that all people receiving Motability, those people that get their cars provided for them because they are disabled, are at least hybrids, if not fully electric. And Doncaster, because of its circumstances, has higher than the national average of people with disabilities, as I'm sure you're aware from the data that's available. We're allowing units that are not accessible to the disabled to be installed. With planning permission, we are not designing properties in a way that are accessible, not just to the codes that you've just mentioned, but to what the Equalities Act referred to in 2010, and although government did promise that it would give guidance before 2020, it still hasn't. And in many cases, it never will, because they are so far behind the times. Inequality, they fail to comply with their own law. Good reference is, in fact, that all notices should be available into alternative formats. Something we do not do, something the government do not do. Neither do we provide it in alternative formats such as CDs or electronic versions for people that are blind or cannot read for all planning applications, something that was recommended under guidance from the Institute back in 2000. So I'm very interested to hear what you've just said. My concern is that since 1995, the law has required provision for data in alternative and accessible formats, yet you've just admitted you can't do it today. So we do need to actually be meeting what's out there, and with 20% of the population of Doncaster needing adapted property, our target figures are somewhat woeful, both in industrial premises, leisure premises and living accommodation, if you can't even get a wheelchair through the front door to get into the property, which by law is an offence. So why are we allowing people to build things that then lead to them being prosecuted for failing to comply with the Equalities Act and the Disability Discrimination Act and stopping employment? Something that's supposed to be one of our major aims is to get disabled people back into employment when you can't get to work because the planners haven't required the right size access to the sites and toilets.
I think within the context of building regs, and planning law, I think we can answer that, can't we? In that if building regs are in place and they're set by national government, then as a local authority, we would ensure that when our planning inspectors and our private planning inspectors go out, they ensure that buildings do meet those requirements, I'm sure.
Sorry, Chair, I'm not asking you to answer the question.
No,
all I would do is I would concur with Chair. We can only create planning legislation which mirrors national planning legislation, and that's the difficulty. If we did try and do something locally, then a developer would appeal and they would win the appeal because it's all part of a national thing. So it's totally take the point that Councillor Pearson raises, but it's a national problem. If they change the national standards, whether it's through building regs in terms of how the houses are built or standards around housing, then we would have to comply through a design code. I mean, I am happy to speak to our data quality team around what we can do around making information more accessible, because clearly we will have a policy relation to that. So I'm happy to pick that up, Councillor Pearson, as well on that. But unfortunately, we're working in a framework that's set by national government, really. And
I would ask that you include the Chief Executive, because this is a matter of discrimination, and whether or not people like it, there is legislation.
Councillor Pearson, I think we're thinking on different trains along here now. You're going on a different road to what I am. But the question I've got for Scott is, are you confident that our planning team and our building inspectors are ensuring that buildings are built according to building regs? And if that doesn't take place, are we taking adequate enforcement action against those developers?
Yes, we are, and we do wherever we can. Clearly, we haven't got hundreds of enforcement staff and hundreds of planners who are doing that, because they're all busy determining things as well. But if things are flagged up to us and there is breaches in that, we do take action. Obviously, the building industry is not forced to use our own building control team, so we can use the private sector, and we've seen a few of those. But what we have seen encouraging from government is there is some new standards come through on that. So there's examinations that our team are having to take. We've seen a few businesses go pop in Doncaster, building control businesses who are not going down that line of getting people qualified, but we certainly are. So we try and be diligent. We just wish we had more resource around that.
And Scott, are you confident that if a complaint came in relation to building regs and buildings not up to a standard, that we would investigate and carry out the relevant enforcement action?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a process to do that. As I say, sometimes capacity can be an issue depending on what the workloads of the teams. But if a complaint comes in, it will be investigated. You know, and even though the planning enforcement area doesn't sit in our area because it's been kind of amalgamated into a more flexible team, there is really close liaison with the planning and building regs teams.
Thank you, Scott. Councillor Robinson.
Can I ask that the data is provided then on how many enforcement cases meet that criteria, please?
So which criteria? No. The criteria we were talking about was whether or not complaints come in. Until a complaint comes in, we're not able to carry out any kind of enforcement action or investigation. So I think that's a fair request from Councillor Pearson. If we could provide data on the complaints that we get in relation to building regs and buildings not being compliant, and how and just the outline figures around that, Scott, would that be possible?
Yeah, if I work with Christine, it wouldn't be our teams. Building regs, we can supply that information if they're getting complaints, but if it's general enforcement, that will be the enforcement team with Scott Forbes. But if you link up with me afterwards, I'm sure we'll be able to get some info together. Okay, no problem.
Councillor Robinson.
Thank you. You did give us compelling evidence for the successfulness of the implementation of the plan, so I really do think you need to be commended for that. Thank you. What I want to explore with you is this aspect of being 23% over target for new homes. Now, I do understand, because I've heard from officers before and read the reports about how impactful it is, the positive impact on the local economy of those new homes that have to be furnished, and, the way it kind of provides that economic stimulus that's good. But what I want to ask you, particularly in the context of what you said at the beginning, that we are in the 20% of most disadvantaged areas within the country. Is there a tipping point? Does there come a point where being over target actually ceases to be a good thing and starts to be a bad thing for the people living in our city? And also, when we were talking about the 15 to 23% of affordable homes, in the context of the cost of living crisis, have we adjusted our measure of what constitutes an affordable home?
Thanks, Councillor. That's something that was discussed at the examination about the housing kind of supply during this plan period. And there's a graph in the local plan that's the trajectory. And what that shows is, rather than those 920 homes neatly being built every year throughout the plan period, what it showed was a very front-loaded trajectory. Partly that was a reflection that we had a large supply of existing planning permissions and houses with permission at that point that were being built and were coming forward and were contributing to our requirement, which meant we didn't have to allocate as many additional new sites through the process. The only way to kind of spread that out and make it nice and even is if you have something like phasing policies that say, after this, first 5 years of the plan period, those sites in this community will then be allowed to come forward through planning. And then at the end of the plan period, the next ones can come forward. And we have had development plans in the past in Doncaster that had that approach, and they were perhaps rightly criticised on the basis of the local plans being informed on what the borough's housing need is as at that point in time when the plan's being prepared. So why would we as an authority want to suppress that and delay that throughout a plan period for the sake of having kind of even numbers of housings coming forward year on year? So rather than have that, we've got a very front-loaded trajectory. That means housing needs being met quicker and sooner in the plan period. That also means more affordable houses are being built sooner and quicker in the plan period. And we see that as a positive, good thing. It doesn't mean that some of these record levels that we're seeing are going to carry on and keep going up and up and up and up. If you look back over the last 10, 20, 30 years, you'll see housing is always cyclical and things ultimately do go down as well as go up. We obviously had the banking crisis when housing delivery was in the low hundreds. It's gradually increased up and up since then. We then had COVID. I, for one, thought we may be back in a similar situation in years and years of very low delivery. So it's brilliant that we've resiliently bounced back from that. But that's hopefully explaining the question of, it's not that we're building too many houses. It's doing exactly what the plan kind of forecast was going to happen. But ultimately, the point will come where sites are built up, they're used up, people are occupied, they're living in them. But it's this continuous 5-year review and feedback where you're going back through, you're constantly looking at what's happening with housing needs, what's changed. Do you need to go back and have another look at those policies? Do you need to look if you need to allocate some new sites? What the spatial strategy is, moving forward. We'll have to have conversations and engage with all of you on how we might like to see housing come forward in the future and where that housing and growth and development should take place. We're a city now. You've just alluded to the second part of your question, cost of living crisis and things that have changed since we adopted the plan. There's lots of other things that have, no one was planning for a global pandemic when the plan was being locked down. We knew things were going to happen around Brexit, wars in Ukraine and all that type of stuff that's happened. That's constantly why we're doing this monitoring, looking at how things are performing and at what point do we then need to go back and revisit things. And it might be you just pick up 2 or 3 things. You leave the design policies, you leave the policies around conservation alone because they're fine, they're working, and you just look at a very specific kind of number of issues through a plan review. So hopefully that answers the first part of your question. I think the second part of your question was about affordable housing needs and the cost of living crisis. So in planning, the definition of affordable housing is given to us by government in the back of the National Planning Policy Framework. These types of affordable housing can and do change. So one of the latest one is around starter homes. But at the point the local plan was done, that target was very much informed around our housing needs study that was done just in the run-up to the local plan. That's where we got that 23% or 15% affordable housing figure from. I think this last year of the plan period, we've seen 361 affordable homes built, which is a record for this plan period. The housing needs study back then showed we needed 200 a year on top of what the council was doing for its own council house new build programme. So reason to be optimistic that the affordable housing is coming forward, as well as the market housing, and those are all reflected in those completion figures. That's affordable and market housing on the slide earlier. And we've future-proofed the local plan and the policy, so we know these things change over time. So if you look at the policy, what it says is those applications and decisions will be informed by the latest housing need assessment. So that acknowledges that when we update the housing needs assessment, that will take account of what the latest understanding is about affordable housing need and other housing needs across the borough, and that then becomes the thing that the policy signposts the applicant to take into account. I mentioned earlier, I think, as part of Councillor Noon's response, we've got those figures in the plan based on the last housing needs assessment, but as and when those change, the council will publish that evidence base, and that's what planning applications will have to refer to. And I guess, probably just to end on this point, whether the market will ever bring forward the scale and the number of houses and address the national affordable housing issue is obviously much covered in the press, and there's an awful lot of consensus that seems to be, if we really want to meet this genuine affordable challenge, there needs to be some sort of hugely public subsidised council house building programme, the likes we've not seen perhaps since the close of the war. But I'll try not to get political, but hopefully that's answered your question. So.
Yes. What I just wanted to come back on is in relation to the fact that we're exceeding the target, and you did explain about pieces of land and then they're not built on, then they are, and then goes up and down, and I get that. But given that we're this far over target, can we not be more flexible with the disposal of our land so that it doesn't necessarily go to the really big house builders, but we provide greater opportunities for self-build or for local building firms in Doncaster to build 4, 5 and 6 houses? And the other thing about the big builders that people complain about is that they tend to build very similar properties. So if you are not, an average family, if you're a multi-generational family or somebody within that family has a disability or, some other sort of need, how hard it can be sometimes to find the sort of property that meets your needs. And so what I'm wondering is, given that we're as successful as we are, does that give us the opportunity to do more around what I've just said?
I think to answer the question about those smaller developers and those kind of family builders and businesses, the local plan allocated sites that were big enough to build 5 new homes on. That was the threshold that, again, the government guidance says we should go down as small as we should look to allocate. On top of that, what we do monitor and have coming forward is lots of kind of infill developments, 1, 2, 3, 4 house types of units. They often are the ones that lend themselves to those kind of smaller family developers. And then again, some of the SME type businesses are more sort of the 5 to kind of 40 type units. So we do have a good mix of sites in our supply, and again, all those housing completion figures, that's everything that's been built in the borough. That's not just what's happening on the sites we specifically allocated. And some of the monitoring we have, it will show you how much of the housing is on the sites we've allocated, how much of it is what's called windfall development. That might be a term you've come across. And that's likely to be those smaller sites, very much kind of efficient use of land. And through the local plan examination, though, just want to make the point, we made an assumption because we could evidence that in a borough the size of Doncaster, with all the huge kind of range of settlements, communities, towns and villages we've got, we've always had a consistent supply of those sorts of developments coming forward. So we made an allowance of 200 new homes per year coming forward on those sorts of sites. And that came off the overall requirement, which meant we didn't have to allocate as many sites because we knew we would have that consistent sort of supply. Does that make sense? Or, yeah, thank you.
Chair, if I could just add as well, we are proactively working with a group of SME builders because they're just not set up like the bigger companies. So we are trying to look at ways that they can be more competitive with sites and potentially work together so that they can take on bigger sites and take a chunk themselves. So we have regular meetings with a group, and we take on board a lot of feedback of what their frustrations is, and we try and work with that. Unfortunately, a lot of the sites that Jonathan's mentioned, the vast majority, probably 99% of them, are not owned by the council, and so we haven't got got that level of control. But there is a need, as you said, Councillor Robinson, for that type of product. I think as well, it's trying to get our strategic housing working on some of the land that we do control, like through Council House Build programmes, try and offer opportunities for that, where you can get tailored housing to really target the needs of what people have got. Because sometimes it might be great delivering lots of housing, which is great, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's the right housing to meet the need. And the problem we've got again is, I'm not blaming government, but I am. They're just sort of saying, get some houses built, get some houses built. And we're doing really well, so we're not under pressure. But a lot of local authorities would be just like, just build them anywhere, whatever they're like. We're not bothered as long as it helps with the numbers. And sometimes I think agencies like Homes England can be a little bit like that. So I think we are in a phase where we can try and now drive up the quality, because we have got a good, strong housing pipeline. As Jonathan showed you, you know, there's a good 7-year kind of programme there. So we can, you know, and we have done this through the local planners, put policies in there to try and get the qualitative side of things up. But if we can work with the SMEs to sort of say some of these niche developments where people can do self-builds as well in conjunction with them, it's a great point, and we will put that back into our next meeting with them.
No, I'd just like to add that was a great question from Councillor Robinson, and that you are having regular meetings with SMEs. Can we have a report? You know, when a report's available, how it's going. You know, what plans and designs have actually been implemented.
Yeah, we could actually kind of capture some of the conversations that we've been having, and then again, I'd link with Christine around it. We are due another meeting with them. I'm saying it doesn't cover everyone, but there's probably 5 or 6 SMEs come together as a group and sort of say, this would work better for us, that would work better for us. So we do try and do that, don't we, on a fairly regular basis. So yeah, we can pass that on, Councillor Farmer.
Councillor Robinson, another question or? No. Councillor Church?
Could you please explain how the flood risk management strategy links with the local plan, please?
Thanks, Councillor. I'll try and answer that one. So when the local plan was being prepared, there was a local flood risk management strategy for Doncaster. I think it was the 2014 one at the time. So that was very much on the table alongside all the other kind of council strategies and evidence that we looked at and reviewed and fed into the local plan. I'm aware the council late last year have adopted a new local flood risk management strategy in 2023. And I think the one thing that is consistent between those is that those strategies are very much focusing on our responsibilities as a Lee Local Flood Authority or colleagues. They're not my responsibility, but very much around managing surface water flooding, groundwater flooding, highways flooding, those sorts of things, rather than the wider main river flooding, which is obviously the responsibility and remit of the Environment Agency. So we did take account of the 2014 strategy. And we're also already actioning the 2023 strategy. There's 5 strategic aims in there, of which 2 are most relevant to ourselves here in planning and the local plan. Aim 1 is around continually improving our understanding of flood risk in Doncaster. And one of the actions under that, it commits the council to keeping up to date its strategic flood risk assessment. So I can hopefully assure you that since that strategy was adopted last autumn, myself and colleagues, including the Lee Local Flood Authority that led on that strategy, we've already met the Environment Agency and we're already discussing the scope of updating our current strategic flood risk assessment. We've just this week secured some funding internally, so we're now working on a brief and a spec to procure specialist flood risk engineers, and again, jointly being done between ourselves in planning and colleagues in the Lee Local Flood Authority. So we can already demonstrate that one of the key actions relevant for planning in that strategy that was adopted last autumn is in hand, and we'll be able to update on that later this year. So hopefully some assurance there. What that will enable is we've got a number of things, how that directly feeds back to the local plan. What that study will do, it will update the detailed boundaries of what's called the functional floodplain. So that is parts of the borough and land that is deliberately designed and set aside to flood in times of extreme flooding. We know, for example, from the flooding in 2019, there was parts of land that were underwater that the previous assessment didn't identify. So this study will give us an up-to-date understanding of that. That will be done in conjunction and agreement with the Environment Agency. We will then designate that and update the layer on our local plan policies map, because national planning policy is almost an embargo for development in those areas for obvious reasons. So there's an example of how things constantly change, but how the local plan's kind of been future-proof to allow for those things to be built in. Another example of that is we have a policy in the local plan that says if you're bringing forward an application in an area that's got some residual flood risk, it says applicants should bring those forward and do flood risk assessments in accordance with the latest information in that strategic flood risk assessment. So that might be things around what finished floor levels developers should build to. So the policy is fairly high level, a bit like the housing needs example I gave earlier. It refers and directs the applicant to the detailed evidence base, and as long as we keep those up to date, we can constantly deal with changing and evolving understanding around flood risk. The other key part of the strategy that's relevant for Doncaster is aim 4, which is encourage flood resilience measures in local planning policy. So as well as the strategic flood risk assessment update that I've just referred to and committed to, there's some other key actions there. So the lead local flood authority is statutory consultee on all planning applications. So they are consulted and they respond as to whether they can support them in respect to what that development will do in terms of drainage, making sure it's not increasing flood risk to existing communities and surrounding land and property, making sure water is stored on site for appropriate techniques as part of being what's known as the SUDS approval body. So again, hopefully a bit of assurance that we work very closely with colleagues in the Leigh Local Flood Authority that have brought forward that strategy. There's some clear actions for us as the planning department, and I can commit that we are already on top of those and happy to report back next year or before then as to where we've got to with those. Thank you.
Just come back in. Yeah, thank you for that, Jonathan. Thanks for the answer. Would they be able to update our panel with the progress with that as well, please, Chair?
I think it would definitely be worthwhile having another joint meeting and inviting both panels together, and we can get an update together if everyone's in. Okay. Councillor Pearson?
It would be very useful for us to have an update, particularly on the fact that Yorkshire Water and other water authorities have had the barrier removed from maximum fineage for sewage outlets. We keep getting reports to planning that the water system will take the water, where in fact, has been proved in court, and the 3 million dispersals of sewage at least per annum, that the sewage is not being treated when we build new properties. Yet we accept on face value a report, or planning accepts on face value a report that says there are no issues, yet the government itself is now looking at taking at least one water authority back into public ownership because it's failing. So is it really appropriate for you to be taking on face value response from water authorities saying they can take the sewage from a build or from a highway, when in fact they're dumping it in the Don at a regular basis and out into the Humber?
Chair, to Councillor Pearson's point, we have statutory consultees that we have to consult with, and obviously the water authorities are that. Until that time changes and government says these are not fit for purpose, which is the kind of point being made, and I do appreciate the point being made, we do have to take their expert advice because we're not water experts. So this is why we do have a network of consultees, and when an application comes in, it triggers a whole host of relevant consultations taking place with expert bodies. How that will pan out in the future, given what Councillor Pearson's talked about, we don't know. There could be change to that, but for the minute, we do have to take what they say as read as expert advisors on those aspects. We do have our own internal drainage team as well, which does help out on that. But where matters, where you're dealing with the larger agencies, we do have to take their consultation response for planning applications. That's just the national way it's set up.
Thank you, Scott. The purpose of the meeting today was to consider and comment on the local plan and its effectiveness. And I'm glad that we've had such a robust conversation and questions put forward. We're going to move on to Helen's presentation now.
Okay, thank you very much. So I'm going to just run through a little bit about biodiversity net gain. It's a slightly abstract concept in some ways, so I'm going to give a little bit of background. Some of you may have had before, some may not. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the recent changes that have occurred with biodiversity net gain. Okay, so what is biodiversity net gain? Well, development can cause negative impacts on biodiversity through habitat loss, and biodiversity net gain is defined as an approach to development that seeks to leave the natural environment in a measurably better state than it was before a development occurred. It aims to avoid and then mitigate damaging impacts from development, and then, having quantified the remaining impacts, it seeks to deliver measurable improvements to biodiversity through either habitat creation or enhancement. Now, the important word on this slide is measurably. So we've long had planning policies in place that require planning applications to consider biodiversity and to provide compensation and replacement habitats, but there's never been before a defined way of measuring biodiversity losses. Okay, so where has biodiversity net gain come from? Well, the need for development to deliver net gains in biodiversity originated in planning policy. So the National Planning Policy Framework requires planning decisions to contribute to and enhance the natural and local environment by minimising impacts on and providing net gains for biodiversity. Within our local plan, we have Policy 30, and that goes further than the NPPF. It requires planning proposals to deliver a minimum of a 10% net gain in biodiversity. What's happened very recently in the last few months is that the Environment Act has come into force, and the Environment Act changes things slightly because it amends the Town and Country Planning Act, and it means that by law development has to demonstrate a minimum of 10% net gain in biodiversity. This is different to just being a requirement of planning policy. It's now a requirement of law. Okay. Now, the start dates for mandatory net gain are staggered. So for major applications, it came into force on February 12th. For minor developments, so things like small numbers of houses, 1 to 9 units, or smaller commercial developments up to 1,000 metres squared, then it's due to come into force on the 2nd of April. For really big national infrastructure projects, it comes into force in November 2025. So does B&G apply to everything? Essentially, the answer to that is no. There are some permanent exemptions. So householder applications, if your next door neighbour's building an extension, they don't have to consider biodiversity net gain. Permitted development doesn't need to consider net gain. Developments have an impact on a very small area of habitat, something called the de minimis threshold. So this is if there is an impact on less than 5 by 5 metres square of habitat, or less than 5 metres length of something like a hedge, then you don't have to provide a net gain assessment with your planning application, provided it's not a priority habitat, which are the very, special, particularly special habitats. Self-build and custom-build development is exempt from B&G, provided it's not more than 9 dwellings, it's not a very large site, and provided that all the dwellings on the site are custom-built or customer-built housing. The urgent crown development is exempt. If you were wanting to build a habitat bank, so you're wanting to do a nature conservation project, creating lots of habitat, say wetland, and it's engineering works, you're going to have diggers on there, so you need planning permission, but the purpose of what you're doing it for is you're creating a habitat bank and you're intending to create biodiversity units by doing it, then you're exempt from demonstrating net gain within that particular application. And finally, HS2, high-speed rail, is exempt. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about how biodiversity is measured, because it's a slightly odd thing, really. But biodiversity is measured in something we call biodiversity units. And a unit of biodiversity is this term of measurement that includes 3 separate things. So the area of habitat, how much there is, how distinctive or special that habitat's considered, and finally, how good an example of the habitat it is, or its condition. A unit also will take into account whether the habitat being lost is particularly important in that location. So that's called its strategic significance. So to put that into context, a bit of an example with grassland, we have a playing field, so common grassland. It's not very special, it's not distinctive, it's common, widespread. And it's not in a good condition for a grassland. It's mown very frequently. It's not got a structural diversity, doesn't support lots of different animals. In contrast, you might have a limestone grassland, species rich. So this is a rare habitat. It's not widespread, and it's considered special or distinctive. And depending on your management, it could vary in condition, but if it was grazed, if it was wasn't full of weeds or physical damage, then it might be considered in good condition. So these 2 examples of grassland, if you had 1 hectare of playing field, it would be worth 2 biodiversity units. But if you had 1 hectare of limestone grassland, it would be worth 20 biodiversity units, around approximately. Or you could have 10 hectares of playing field being worth the same as 1 hectare of limestone grassland. So this is how we're measuring biodiversity unit within planning applications, in using this term called the biodiversity unit. That's sort of an example of what that actually means. So I wanted to next show you, within the context of a planning application, how losses and gains in biodiversity are assessed. So DEFRA has developed a metric tool and detailed guidance that an ecologist will use to assess the baseline number of biodiversity units on a site before a development takes place. So in this example, the site's worth 10 biodiversity units before development. They use the same metric to then estimate how many units of biodiversity there will be on the site after the houses or whatever's being built have been developed. And in this example, you can see that post-development, they're estimating this is going to be 4 units on the site. Now, we obviously have a problem here because they're not delivering a net gain. There's clearly a loss. So they're going to have to do something about that. And they have to create something off-site. So off-site, somewhere else, they use the same metric, calculate the delivery of 7 extra units of biodiversity. So you end up with your 4 units on-site, 7 units off-site, 11 units in total, and therefore you've achieved your 10% net gain relative to the baseline number of units that were present on the site. So that's a sort of example of what's looked at through the planning process. So prior to mandatory BNG coming in earlier this year, we've been using the local plan policy to require developers to deliver a 10% net gain. We have a supplementary planning document as well as the local planning policy that covers biodiversity net gain. And within that, we ask developers to try and find an off-site BNG project as close to the site as they can, or as a last resort, if they can't find a project, to pay a financial contribution to the council that's secured via a Section 106. And then the council will use that money to go and try and deliver biodiversity units on behalf of the developer. Now, under mandatory net gain that's coming in now, this is going to change slightly. Specifically, we're no longer going to be allowed to accept these financial contributions for offsetting the impacts caused by development. I'm just going to run through a few new terms that have come in with this new change. So Firstly, we have something called the biodiversity gain objective. So this is quite simple. It's just to ensure that planning permission, where granted, delivers at least 10% net gain in biodiversity. That's the objective. Now, the way the statutory framework for net gain works is principally going to be through a post-planning decision general biodiversity condition. So to discharge this general biodiversity condition that gets put on a planning permission, a developer has to provide to the council a biodiversity net gain plan. And this is a document that sets out how they are going to meet the net gain objective. Now, it will show what on-site biodiversity units they're going to secure, and it will also show where any off-site units are going to be secured. So if you look at this in the this is a diagram of the process that will take place. So the developer submits their planning application. The planning authority will then check it, and we will look at specifically, do we agree that their ecologists have properly assessed what the site is worth in biodiversity units pre-development. So we check that. After that, the permission can potentially be granted. So we could subject to attaching this general biodiversity condition to the planning permission. After the permission's been granted, the developer is then allowed to submit their biodiversity gain plan, and we then consider that. So we will check then what they're proposing to deliver on site, the final approved details of that, and we will check if they've gone and found some biodiversity units off-site. We will check that those are registered, that they're all proper. There's various processes that they have to go through to demonstrate that those units are available and properly securable. So we will check those things, and once we're happy with all of that, then we will be able to discharge the biodiversity gain plan condition, essentially. So when that's approved, after that point, development can begin. So the way this statutory legislation set this up is it's a post-planning decision mechanism. So a lot of the detail comes after planning permission is granted. In addition, there is most off-site B&G will be delivered through habitat banks. So the developer will go and they will find a scheme that they can buy units from. The last resort, if they can't find a scheme, is they can buy something called statutory government credits. So this is a bit like our tariff, but it replaces it. So the contributions we used to be able to accept, we now can't offer, but the developer can buy those credits from government instead. So instead the developer goes away and they find units on the open market and they show us where those are in their biodiversity gain plan. Now, it's important that, unfortunately, we can't choose where off-site units are delivered. There are incentives, though, for more local delivery within the metrics that are used. And the developer can't just automatically say, I can't be bothered, I'm going to buy statutory credits from government. They're not allowed to do that. They have to demonstrate that they've looked properly for units on the open market first. They aren't going to want to buy statutory credits either because they are very, very, very expensive. So they're tiered in cost depending on what habitat and how difficult it is to create, how important it's considered. But I think these will be used very much as a last resort. So in terms of within Doncaster and biodiversity net gain sites in Doncaster, it's really important at the moment. One of the main pieces of work we're trying to do is to support a developing market for off-site B&G sites in Doncaster, because fundamentally we want to see impacts from development compensated for within the borough. So we're working on developing B&G schemes on council-owned land. We're also looking at the private market, because fundamentally the private market is going to have an important role to play in this. So people like private landowners, farmers could deliver biodiversity net gain units on their sites. Okay, I'm going to stop for questions.
Thank you. Just something I picked up in the presentation. If you were to speculate, why would have HS2 been exempt from?
I couldn't possibly comment.
Councillor Pearson.
Thank you.
They are, yeah.
Thank you, Chair. Well, I can comment because we've got land in Conisbrough and Denby running on to Mexborough that is that limestone grass. In the last few weeks, I've met with Street Scene and others about the maintenance of a number of areas that cover many hectares of land on the crags and surrounding areas. So I'm going to ask, how do I protect my rare and at-risk grasses and orchids and the like under your scheme? Because I think it's just become very valuable public open space.
I know some of the sites around there well, and they are fantastic. In terms of how to protect them, if protecting them from development in that sort of sense, they're quite valuable. There's limestone grassland, so they're worth a lot of biodiversity units as a baseline. So they're less likely to get built on because they have a high value, so they're expensive to compensate for. In terms of improving condition, it's something we're looking at across a range of council sites, council-owned sites. You know, what can we do on these sites to either create new habitat or manage existing habitat and try and deliver biodiversity net gain projects from that, and then those would be funded by development. That's a very big piece of work, but we are actively looking at that. Where can we deliver projects? And in some cases, it might be that existing grasslands could be better managed, and then that might deliver units. But it very much depends on individual circumstances.
Thank you for that. As I said, the Crags is a very specific site that I'm talking about, and I am very much wanting to make sure it's protected, both in the short and long term. And part of the problem is, as you must probably be well aware, our present landscape management across the borough tends to mow out and destroy limestone habitat by ignorance and people who are not in the business of horticulture as I am. So I really think that this biodiversity situation, we need to be sort of making sure our plans and our plan of the area highlights both where it's just the grasslands, but we've got Ladies Valley that's got some very rare and unusual plants growing in there, but only grow there at certain times because of other impacts. And if Street Scene don't prune trees down, it destroys the land. So as part of your discussion, will you be earmarking as a protected zone those areas that need to be kept in the format they are, so somebody doesn't turn it into creeping fescue, plain field, standard grasslands, rather than these rare and very valuable land masses for unusual species and insects?
I certainly hope we won't be turning limestone grassland into playing field. I mean, there's lots of things going on at the moment, sort of wide protections for conservation sites or sites of interest. So the local nature recovery strategy is being developed at the moment. So that's a South Yorkshire strategy, but it's going to identify areas of existing biodiversity value. So sites that are considered of current value would be identified within that, and also sites that have potential to become of really good value could be identified within that. There'll be several different layers. So that's sort of an evolving piece of work that members of our team are working on at the moment, and certainly something I could raise with them about that particular area. Okay.
Thank you. Councillor Farmer?
Thank you. You've already explained now the net gains being implemented and whatnot, but can you highlight the benefits that's already been gained?
So in terms of whilst we've been operating under the sort of planning policy BNG system, as I call it, so the planning applications that we've dealt with prior to it becoming mandatory, we've collected Section 106 contributions from that, and we've currently got one project that I'm seeking to get approval for to deliver a project now. Now, we've had some contributions. We want to spend some of that money and deliver a project. So that's a project working with the Wildlife Trust, and it would be delivering grassland habitats. So it's existing, not very good grassland, and they would be managing it, grazing it, and also creating ponds. So that's the site near Rossington. So that's quite an exciting one. That'll deliver about 40 to 50 biodiversity units. So that's one scheme. In terms of other projects, things in the pipeline are with the site near Sandalbeat that was approved by Cabinet for development as a habitat bank. That will probably come forward as units for sale on the open market to compensate for mandatory. But we're equally looking at other assets that we have, other land assets that the council has, and we've got a series of sites that we're currently investigating whether we could deliver biodiversity net gain projects on those and the scope of what those would be. But they're quite big projects, so it takes time to bring them forward. But it's a positive picture for being able to do things moving forward.
Is it also working in conjunction with the street scene?
It varies. We're not working specifically with street scene on either of these projects. Generally, a habitat bank project needs to be on quite a big site to have that economy of scale. And there's, within the biodiversity metric that's used to sort of calculate how many biodiversity units something delivers, there's quite specific things you have to do. So it's not necessarily just a case of taking an existing site that we own and manage in a particular way and changing the management on that. That's not necessarily always what would be necessary. You might need to do something a bit more radical with it. We were going to, in terms of management on councils on these sites that we might bring forward as habitat banks, we're going to explore the various options available to us about who would do that management. It might be street scene, it might not, it might fit better with, it depends on capacity, who's got capacity to do that work. We might have to get a third party to do it, like we're working with the Wildlife Trust on the site near Rossington.
Just so I'm clear on this, you mentioned that at Sandalbeat there'll be areas that will be selling as part of net biodiversity gain credits. Now, could there be a time when, even though we've sold that and allocated that as a credit, then that land could be developed on and then we would have to buy credits elsewhere? Does that make sense? Where you end up just going in circles and round?
So on sites where if we were to create a habitat bank and that was to be used as a mandatory net gain habitat bank where we sell units on the open market, those sites they could come forward for development, but you just wouldn't do it because it would be very expensive because you'd have to compensate for the fabulous habitat you'd created on them or you were planning to create on them, so you'd have a very high benchmark. In terms of the site by Sandalbeat Wood, we did consider that. Is this site likely to come forward as a development site, say for housing in the future? And it was sort of felt by colleagues that it wasn't really suitable for that. I think I'm right in saying it's Greenbelt, countryside policy area, nearly Greenbelt, and it's right adjacent to the SSSI. So there's lots of things that mean you just wouldn't necessarily see development on that site. But that is something we are considering in selecting sites. We're not going to choose sites that we think have got a market value, say for other purposes like development.
Thank you. Councillor Beach.
Thank you. This is a bit hypothetical. You've touched on it on how losses and gains and diversity are assessed. There's a site, and Councillor Noon will know where I'm talking about, which is full of caravans. Well, they're park homes. Now, this site is absolutely a mass of trees. I mean, it's so dense that they have to have the street lights on in the day. Except just at the moment because there's no leaves on the trees. Now, whilst some of the trees are perimeter and they're big old trees, and that's fine. Most of it is self-set, bits of whips and things. How would you, if somebody wants to sell it and somebody wants to build houses on it, obviously it's going to be a lot of clearance. Do two things. Do those sort of self-set trees count in it? And how on earth would you find enough? I mean, you'd be taking 90% of the stuff away. How on earth can you find enough land and units to replace what would go? Although what is there is, frankly, I mean, long whips of trees that wave around in the wind. And
so, in terms of whether you would have to compensate for that, probably, I don't know the site, but probably yes, you would. So young trees aren't worth as many biodiversity units as a long-established woodland. So it might have a lower value because of that. The ecologist surveying the site would have to assess what the value of that habitat is in biodiversity units, and then they would have to find units for sale somewhere to buy that deliver that habitat. So it would have to be, they'd have to find woodland units probably for sale somewhere, and that will be from a scheme where either somebody is planting a new woodland, or they have an existing woodland that isn't in very good condition, but they're going to invest in it and they're going to manage it better and they're going to improve the condition of that. So that's how it sort of works essentially, is they'd have to compensate for that somewhere.
I mean, you say young trees, they're just thin and self-set. They could be, 70 foot high. They're huge. But they're just little sticks almost with branches stuck on the top. So, as value, they're probably very little. But having said that, they would count in taking them away.
Councillor Manzi, do you have a question?
Yes, thank you. Good afternoon, Helen. Nice to see you. Bear with me, this may be long-winded. I'll try. Historically, for years now, we've had 106 agreements in place, or rather community zone, whichever you want to call them, which benefit our communities because they had a part to play. They told us, ward members, what they wanted to do with the money, etc., etc. Now the local communities, by this VNG document, are looking at more and more developers, and it's a lot more and more, are now using affordable housing as a way out of paying 106 monies to our local communities, which to me is a detriment to our local communities. When you look at this document here, where the headline is net gain in Doncaster prior to mandatory BNG, developers could not deliver 10% net gain on site. I tell you, because of the resort to pay council, biodiversity instead of per unit of 106 agreements. Am I right in assuming, because I have great concerns here, is this a way in by this government at a backdoor attempt to do away with 106 agreements? Because on the other side of new strategy biodiversity credits, that page, the first line says, for new applications from the town of the ferry, we can no longer say to developers that they can pay diversity offsetting the council secured via a 106 agreement. Where are we coming from here? Because our seriously concerned, I am of the opinion, I could be wrong and I hope I'm wrong, but is this government coming through the back door to do away with 106 agreements which are used for our community benefits and our developers? Thank you, Chair.
What's changing about Section 106 agreements under mandatory BNG is just relating to contributions for biodiversity net gain. It's not relating to other contributions. So Section 106 agreements often ask for contributions for all sorts of different things. So it might be school places or community facilities or, you know, public open space. None of that is changing. We will still be able to ask for contributions where appropriate for those needs for local communities. We have up until now asked for these contributions for biodiversity impact. We're now being told we can't do that anymore, but only for that particular element of a Section 106 ask. So instead, they have to find biodiversity units for sale on the open market and buy those. So I don't think it's a mechanism for doing away with Section 106 for other forms of, you know, what you rightly mentioned are very important contributions for local communities, but it is taking away our opportunity to use it for biodiversity net gain contributions. Does that answer your question?
It does to a degree. Can I give you this example? If you have a 20-acre field that could be developed with a housing developer, and if the BNG was in place, because it's a major one, and it doesn't start till April, I believe. No, a major one starts February the 12th. At the moment, that developer would be asked to either make a 106 agreement to provide green space within that housing complex. Where does BNG fit inside that if they can't? This affordable housing, it doesn't help people in that particular situation. To me, it's a giveaway to developers.
So if a proposal for housing came in now on a site of that scale, it would have to meet all the other policies in the local plan that require things like on-site public open space, affordable housing, any contributions to highways, those sorts of things. So that will still be a requirement, and the policies are there that require that. There is a policy in the plan that was requiring biodiversity net gain as well, but now that we've moved from the policy to it being mandatory, that will be picked up, as Helen's presentation said, as a matter of law. The developer will have to meet their BNG obligations, but that doesn't mean they won't be providing public open space or all those other traditional contributions through the more conventional Section 106 approach that we've all been used to for many, many years now, if that's the question.
Does that mean then that green space and 106 monies are protected here with this BNG agreement?
When we did the policies in the local plan that sets out how much of the site should be set aside for public open space and the 23% affordable and all that, we had to do a whole load of viability work that made assumptions around how much those things cost the developer. And in front of the government inspector, that was a key piece of evidence that was tested to show that generally the majority of sites that come forward should be able to contribute and deliver those developer contributions in line with the relevant policy requirements. So BNG had a cost element applied to it the same way colleagues gave us costings for school places, an average costing for highway contributions and all those usual things. That was all fed into the viability. The thing that's changed is for the last few years, technically something could be negotiated away as being a planning policy requirement through evidence of a site-specific viability appraisal. Under BNG being mandatory, that will have to be delivered and obligations met. That can't be negotiated away, if that makes sense.
So, bear with me, Chair. So, are we saying now, and I'll let you a definitive answer, when BNG comes in now for major developments on the February the 12th this year, right? Where are we now then with affordable housing and 106 agreements? Are they still in place? And can you give me assurance that they are in place now? Whatever the government decided, if they do, 106 agreements, affordable housing is still in place alongside BNG. Is that correct?
We still enter and will continue to enter into Section 106 agreements to secure affordable housing in line with the local plan policy of 15 to 23%, depending on the market value area. So yes is the answer to that question.
Councillor Beach and then Councillor Nevitt.
I think when I asked the previous question, but just to clarify that any of the sites for the biodiversity net gain, they can be anywhere. That's so, is it?
Yes, so a developer can choose where they buy. We can't tell them where they have to buy their biodiversity units from. That the government wants it to sort of operate as an open market system, essentially, so they can choose where to get units from. So what we're trying to do at the moment is sort of stimulate getting more sites within Doncaster, so that we have a supply of units. There are incentives within the metric for delivering units more locally to a site, but the government's definition of local isn't the same as my definition of local. I would like really local, definitely never outside of Doncaster. Their areas that they choose are bigger than that. They use something called, they say either within the local planning authority area where the development is, or within something called the national character area of where the planning application is. And national character areas are large sort of landscape scale areas that extend, they're slightly odd shape, but they go up to a narrow bit. There's a bit around the Humberhead levels that sort of extends to the east of the borough. There's another one that covers quite a bit of the borough but goes up north towards North Yorkshire in a sort of narrow strip, and then down a little bit south into Nottinghamshire. So technically a developer could offset in Nottinghamshire or North Yorkshire for a development in Doncaster. But generally what we've found with developers is that they actually do want to spend their money, especially the big ones, they want to spend their money more locally. They want to see impacts and benefits for the communities that they're building houses for, say. So I think as long as we have a supply, if we can help stimulate a market within the borough for these types of sites, which is some of the work we're trying to do at the moment, then we should hopefully see impacts offset more locally.
So they couldn't sort of say, well, all right, I'm going down to Somerset or something.
They can buy units from Somerset if they want to. The rules are if you buy units outside of your local planning authority area or the natural capital area that your development's in, but in a neighbouring one, so a neighbouring local authority, then you have to buy more units than you would if you do within the area. If you go to further away than a neighbouring planning authority, so if you went down to Somerset to buy your units, I think you have to buy double the amount of units. So for each unit that you need to buy, you have to buy twice. So there's a big financial disincentive for offsetting things down south.
Councillor Nevitt.
Thank you, Chair. About when people decide that they're going to build something on a piece of land, where do you start the policing element of this to make sure that if they're going to build something on there, they don't cut all the trees down before they start the planning process? So how far back do you go to make sure that those people are doing the right thing and the biodiversity units are what they actually are when they started?
That's an excellent question. This has been considered by government, and they have set it out in law what people have to do. So when you submit your metric, it's supposed to represent the habitats with your planning application. It's supposed to represent the habitats present on the site on the day you submit the planning application. So it's got to be an assessment that says, this is what the site's like now. If you've deliberately cleared the site prior to development, you have to state that that's happened, and the assessment you have to provide has to be from before you cleared the site. So, and that dates back to, I think it's somewhere like January 31st, 2020. So when the Environment Act first was released, or the draft versions of it were released, and therefore people knew that they were going to have to do this to stop everyone going out and just madly felling all the trees in the next 2 years before it became law. They said, we can go back to January or 31st, 2020 to look at what was on the site then. So if we suspect that a site has been cleared before they submit for planning application purposes, we can use things like aerial photos, etc., to look at whether there was something there previously. Then we would raise that with them, and we wouldn't agree the baseline biodiversity value of the site. So they won't get their planning permission granted without us agreeing that the baseline value of the site represents what was there before they chopped all the trees down, if they've gone and done that. Does that make sense?
Councillor Noon?
Thank you. Sort of falls into Councillor Pearson's questions about his nice areas that he's got in his ward. So it's not in my ward, and I don't know a lot about the planning application, but the alarming one that jumps out to me, and I believe it's council-owned site, is Rose Hill. So what are the huge offsets for biodiversity on that site? And then why do we continue to push forward for the sale and planning for building on such a biodiversity council-owned asset?
Okay, so within the Rose Hill planning application, they submitted, the ecologists, the developers submitted lots of information about the site, and we checked all of that and agreed it all. So we agreed what the baseline values of the site were, and we also looked at the ecological impacts associated with the development. So taking apart the just number counting of biodiversity net gain, we considered what are the actual impacts on the important receptors, so things like protected species and nearby sites. And the conclusions of that sort of ecological impact assessment was that there was an impact on biodiversity of developing that site, but that those impacts could be compensated for. So within the design of the scheme, they've retained habitat in various areas to try and ensure that the ecological corridors on the site are maintained, so animals can still move around the site in a similar way to how they can do at the moment. Obviously not across the whole site, but the particular corridors. And then in terms of net gain, the developer will have to demonstrate 10% net gain. So if the application is at, it's going through various complicated planning processes at the moment, but before they could start development, they would have to enter a Section 106 to compensate for the units that would be lost. So at the moment, because it's a policy BNG site, they'd have to pay a contribution through a Section 106, and then the council would be able to deliver units using that money to compensate for the losses of habitat on that site.
So as a council, there's nothing that we can't chuck enough money at to develop. Is that sort of where we're going? Because it's a really good council-owned asset. There's loads of people who don't want it to go. So if you've got enough money and you can offset 10%, we'll build on it. Is that sort of where we're going?
I'll bring Scott
Chair,
in.
if I could come in. I mean, the site is an allocated housing site in the local plan. It is being allocated in the unitary development plan. So the site is allocated for residential development. The scheme that was approved is actually amplifying the normal requirements around habitat creation on the site. So it far exceeds open space proposals. Our arboricultural officers have assessed the trees on site as well. There's a lot of self-set trees on there which are not particularly high-ranking specimens. So the resultant scheme has had a reduction in the number of housings to create even more kind of green areas within that site. If we were dealing with the site and it wasn't allocated for housing, it was a greenfield site, then it would clearly struggle from a planning perspective. But as it is an allocated housing site, then technically that's the appropriate land use. So having a developer come in and want to put housing on that site, technically they are in compliance with a local plan. They then have to comply with all the various policies to do with open space, highways, drainage. But what they've done on that site is reduce it down even further to shrink the number of houses and leave even more kind of open space and habitat on that site, which clearly that's been granted by by the planning committee. It's also subject to an appeal as well, so we're waiting. So it'll be decided nationally as well. They're looking at that, but there wasn't anything in the proposal that conflicted any of the policies in the local plan, technically. So if there had been, obviously it'd be difficult to grant something if it is in conflict with policy, but it's policy compliant and an allocated site.
So it's more a local plan issue that we've, as councillors, voted through and for a housing site.
Yeah, it's been included, and again, the site has been included as a residential site for many years as well. So that's you know, sometimes you do end up with sites where they are left open. You do get self-set trees on there, and obviously there's a lot of passion from local people, and we tried to do right by that with a proposal by working with the house builder. So all I would say is the site not only complies with policy, it exceeds it in terms of open space and I suppose the ecology potential on that site.
Thank you. Just following on a different question. You said about offsetting units. Could a company offset 10 units, let's say, for 10 different sites and use the same bid? Is anyone checking this? So I can use one site to offset all 10 sites?
That's a very good question. So DEFRA and government have set up something called the National Sites Register. So if you are delivering any biodiversity units off-site, then the site location where those units are being delivered for you has to be registered on this National Sites Register. And the role of that register is to prevent double counting. So it's to prevent somebody selling the same units to 10 different developers and only creating one lot of habitat. So part of what we will check as a planning authority is that when the developer submits their biodiversity net gain plan, we will look at where their off-site site is. We will look at whether that's registered on the National Sites Register. If it's not, then they can't use it. And we will check whether the units on the National Sites Register that they're saying they're going to buy are registered to them. So those processes are in place to stop that.
Thank you. And then, 1 second. So we're sort of, as a council, going through more rewilding schemes at the moment. Are we looking to use them sites for our bionet gain and then potentially look at selling them units towards the bionet gain? And then I know you mentioned we're cutting less grass now, which is not a bad thing, and then we're in a massively sort of deprived area with green fields and playing fields, and you say it's poor land. So are we going to let that grow, and then is that going to adversely affect kids then going and playing football and rugby and all that stuff as well?
So in terms of the rewilding, generally you probably wouldn't be able to deliver, because it's all calculated biometric, you have to achieve particular things. So just rewilding to me generally involves leaving a site and letting it do its own thing. And that creates some fantastic habitats, but it probably wouldn't meet the criteria and the metric for a particular type of grassland creation, say, or a particular type of scrub creation. So rewilding on its own probably isn't going to be able to generate net gain sites. Your second point was?
About our poor quality, like greenfield sites that we use for football and rugby and all that.
So in considering any site, bringing forward any site as a biodiversity net gain site, we would have to consider what it is used for currently. So if it is a formal open space with poor playing field grassland, yes, I could generate a nice biodiversity uplift on that, but I don't think we would take that forward because you'd be losing that other asset of the playing field. In terms of there's some sites, say, that we're looking at where maybe they are publicly accessible and people maybe go and walk their dog around them currently. But the grassland, it's not a formal playing field, but the grassland isn't great. You could make it a lot better. There's nothing to stop us making that grassland quite a lot better and still letting people access the site and enjoy it. But it'll just look different. We might plant bits of scrub on it, and we might create more meadow grassland habitat. So in some ways we're enhancing the habitats for people on those sites, but still allowing access.
I'll take one more question from Councillor Pearson.
Thank you, Chair. You've just been talking about, you know, public open space, and originally we were talking about a very defined limestone grasses and what have you. Are there any comments about double and triple SIs and also about the use of we've got a lot of open quarries that are growing some very rare and unusual plants within them. So would we also be able to look at areas that are very high limestone, very little actual subsoil, but actually have surface soil that generates unusual plants and wildlife as well as actual grasslands?
So in terms of triple SIs, you're not allowed to use a triple SI as a net gain site. So you can't have a habitat bank or sell biodiversity units from a triple SI, because triple SIs you're supposed to be managing to be good condition anyway. So you can't take that money that you'd sell from those units to serve that purpose. So generally they won't come forward. There are small exceptions, but it's unlikely. In terms of quarries, it would probably depend on the planning history of a quarry site as to whether it would be appropriate as a biodiversity net gain site. You're absolutely right. Some of Doncaster's quarries, some of the old disused quarries, absolutely fantastic habitat. But you would have to have a site, I guess, that had room for improvement on what's there currently, or where you could create something new that's on something that's already low value. And I guess a new quarry application would have to demonstrate net gain. So a new application for quarrying on an area will have to demonstrate net gain itself. So it will probably create that type of habitat rather than buying something elsewhere. It'll probably try and do it on site as part of restoration schemes. So quarries are complicated ones because you have to look at what the extant planning obligations are on those sites. They'd have to fulfil those rather than just delivering a new scheme.
Sorry, to repeat the question, as you're aware that there is legislation on how you backfill a quarry, the ratio of dropped land to refill and the number of times you can refill a quarry every time it sinks 20 feet. So with this sort of thing, would we be able to stop the constant taking off and refilling of waste into quarries that have become tips, and at the same time stop some quarries becoming tips and actually become sites where the biodiversity would thrive very well, as long as nobody ever tipped rubbish in them? Thank you.
I think it would depend on the planning history of the site. It's quite a complicated issue, isn't it? Sort of refilling a quarry and then restoring it. I guess those sorts of things would require planning permission anyway. And if they're implementing a restoration scheme and then saying, oh, actually, I'm going to tip a bit more material in there, they're going to have to put a new restoration scheme on. That's subject to the requirements of planning anyway. So you have to be additional in delivering net gains. So I'm not sure whether that would fall into the additional sort of criteria. Might be outside that.
Final question from Councillor Noon.
It was just a small one. I think I picked it up right. You said after planning permission had been granted, is that right? So is there any risk to businesses sort of like going bust or not carrying out what they're supposed to carry out after the planning permission's gone in and stuff?
So the way net gain's going to work is that we grant planning permission, and then they can tell us what their biodiversity net gain plan is, but they can't start development, so they can't put a spade in the ground until they've demonstrated what their biodiversity net gain plan is and demonstrate that they've secured those units. So they will have had to have bought the units from an off-site habitat bank before they've even put a spade in the ground and started development. So they'll have to have paid for that, or they will have a legal agreement requiring them to pay for that. If they don't then put a spade in the ground, they haven't caused the impact of losing the habitat. So it wouldn't matter. But does that offer some sort of reassurance you can't?
It does for off-site biodiversity. What about for the on-site stuff, if it's a local agreement sort of thing?
So if they're delivering units on-site and they've started, we have to, as a local authority, we have to try and secure what's called significant on-site BNG. So if they're delivering a significant number of units, we would secure that through a legal agreement, usually a Section 106, that they deliver that. And that Section 106 agreement would set out who is responsible for delivery of those things. If the developer went bust after building 10 houses and then, or the foundations, I'm not quite sure how all that would pan out. I will hold my hands up and say I don't know yet. But something we certainly, we'll have to look at in more detail. But we will be looking at things like if they've got a management plan for those habitats on site, how is that funded? We will have to look at that kind of thing. So how are they funding the management of those on-site habitats they're creating? And in approving a plan for an on-site BNG unit delivery, that's something we would examine.
Final question from Councillor Farmer.
Thank you. Right, regarding the monetary value to buy the credits and whatnot, do the developer have to pay up front, or do they just have to have an agreement in place?
I guess it will vary depending on who they're buying them from, but I think generally they'll have a legal agreement that sets out when they have to pay what. So some habitat banks are operating with a sort of, you can reserve units. So, because you've got this, they want certainty of cost. So a developer might pay some money up front, reserve the units whilst they're doing the planning application process. And then at the point they're ready to start putting spades in the ground, they potentially have to pay the rest of the money to secure those units. So generally, I think it's going to operate that they will have paid up front and then they will start their development. They like it, they walk away. They don't have that obligation anymore. Somebody else then delivers the habitat for them.
Helen, Jonathan, thank you very much for your presentations. I'm going to bring this part of the meeting to an end and we'll move on to agenda item 7, which is the work plan. So if you guys want to leave, you're more than welcome to do so. Thank you for attending.
Thank you, Chair. Sorry. Just very quickly, the work plan and the forward plan of key decisions has been circulated to the panel for your information. With regard to the work plan, we're actually at the end of the civic year, so if there's anything that you feel that we should be putting forward to next year, then you can consider that as part of your work planning next year. But there is obviously a couple of areas that have been put forward today which will be taken into account. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you for attending. We'll bring the meeting to an end. Thank you.